All right, we're live, everyone, and talking to Dr. Dana Hicks, who's with me. And the new book is The Knot. That's KNOT. How to Secure Healthy Modern Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. And there it is on the screen for those of
Yeah.
you watching on YouTube. Oh, nice cover. I like it.
Oh, you
I
haven't seen
like
the
it.
cover yet, huh? Okay.
Yeah. So the book is you're a former pastor. You're
Yeah.
in the space of spirituality and religion. So why a book about marriage? And maybe I don't know if this would be a traditional marriage book, would it?
I hope not. It's funny. After I wrote this, I got on Amazon and had no idea how many marriage books are out there. How many people that been married for all kinds of lengths of time, who are writing marriage books. But no, it's not a traditional marriage book. What kind of brought me into it is not that I've had wild success in marriage or anything like that, but I'd had thoughts for a long time about marriage generally, things that I thought needed to be said, especially in the Christian space, spirituality space, that nobody seemed to be saying, because I think marriage is kind of a hot potato. It's kind of a it can be very heated discussion. So when I was pastoring, the things that I said in this book, I probably couldn't have said just because it would have been a little too much for the people that I served, and for the organizations that I worked for. So once I got out of those spaces, I felt the freedom to say that. My thought process on this really began when I read a book by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz called "Marriage: A History." She's a historian out of Washington State, Evergreen College in Washington State, and she traces the history of marriage from the agricultural revolution to today. And after I read the book, I realized, man, everything I thought I knew about marriage was wrong in terms of like its origins, the way we think about it. And so that was sort of what got me on the process of it, and then kind of trying to working through that in my own mind theologically. What does that look like? And that's sort of the origins of the book, I guess.
So theologically, from evangelical Christian Protestant perspective, marriages between one man and one woman. We know this. We hear it all the time. We say it so often that we
Right,
think it was written in stone on Sinai. Um,
right.
so this book doesn't necessarily say that is the only legitimate form of marriage throughout history.
Yeah, not only is it not the only legitimate form of marriage throughout history, it's I mean, when we say biblical marriage, I mean, when you go back to the Hebrew scriptures, there's so many different forms of marriage in the Hebrew scriptures that that looks nothing like marriage as we understand it today. So the form that marriage takes throughout history is as varied as the people that were in those marriages. And for most part of human history, marriage was about survival. It really wasn't about love. And I think that was the biggest surprise to me when I read Stephanie Kuntz's book. People didn't get married for most of human history because they went on dates and fell in love and whatnot. No, families got together and said, listen, we need to have a partnership with this other clan or this other tribe, or we need to find someone that can help work the farm. And I mean, those were the sort of questions they were they were looking for: good workers, good employees, more than they were someone that they had warm fuzzy feelings about. And if they happen
And
to have
like
warm fuzzy feelings,
military
great.
alliances and things like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Of course, if you're higher in the society, you had treaties and things like that. But for the common folks, yeah, it was just mostly about surviving and just making it from one day to the next. And so love was an afterthought to all those things. In
So is
fact,
that
Stephanie
a
Kuntz. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead?
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say
Go ahead.
Stephanie Kuntz argues that marriage. A lot of people early on in marriage's history, they kind of thought that actually being in love with your spouse was kind of problematic, because you don't want to confuse those emotions in an institution as important as marriage. And so you would often find love outside of marriage because it was much safer to do so, because you didn't want to mess up your marriage by actually falling in love with your spouse. So yeah, again, this is a very different way of seeing the world than we're used to, and this is most of human history up until about the last 200 years or so. So
in the writing times of the Jewish Torah, my understanding, monogamy was a pretty strange idea, right? Wasn't monogamy a pretty unique and not a very common thing in the cultures around that day?
well, I mean, having more than one spouse in ancient times was more a symbol of wealth than it was a symbol of anything else, and so, if you were a common person, you probably only had one spouse just because you didn't have the money to have more than that, um, but yeah, the idea of sexual monogamy, at least, yeah, was, that those in the way, at least in the ways that we understood it, were pretty foreign to the Hebrew scriptures, um, and they thought of things very differently than what we did. Yeah, yeah,
Well, all right. So let's get into the crux of the thing. In
yeah.
reading your notes, people are asking, so are you for marriage? Are you against it? And I guess really the question that comes out of reading some of your book, as I've read, and the information I've read and what you sent to me is there a space where polyamory, which is starting to really catch steam in some of the younger generations now, is okay? Is okay with God? I don't even know what question I'm asking there exactly, but is there
Mm,
a
mm.
space for polyamory or these things to come into marriage and still be in a Christian context, I guess?
Yeah, let me take a step back to that first question about am I for marriage or against marriage, and I think that that sort of binary isn't maybe a helpful question. I think I like to think that there's a third way. In other words, I don't want to say, "Hey, here's what marriage is: take it or leave it." You're either for it or against it. I think that marriage, the overall argument for the book is, marriage has changed throughout history. So why can't it change again? Why can't we continue to reinvent it, continue to ask questions about what it means to love the people that are closest to us in unique and different ways? Uh, so the theological framework, to answer your second question about the polyamory and whatnot, I do address that in the book. And the way I land on it is I create a theological framework in one of the chapters in which I take that old saying from architecture: form follows function, and the idea is that when we have a construct, a social construct like marriage, its form, the way it's expressed, is always changing, it's always evolving, it's always becoming new. But its function, it always stays the same. So the way in which its expression will always change, but its essence stays the same. The essence is, how do we create structures in which we can love another person and create for their best well-being in their lives. And what that looks like, how we love another person, changes all the time. The context changes all the time. So, and we know this intuitively, like Paul, you and I have kids, and, the way in which we love our kids changes all the time, because our kids change in age and they change in often what they need. Sometimes they need a hug. Sometimes they need $20. Sometimes they need a swift kick in the pants. Sometimes they need a little bit of correction. Sometimes they need advice. Sometimes, it just depends all the time. So my form is always changing. The way in which I love them is always changing, but the function always remains the same. My intention is always for their best, for their well-being, for their thriving in life, them and the people around them. So in the same way, marriage, I believe, is the same thing. The form can constantly change. The way it expresses itself can constantly change, but but the function always stays the same. So the function is, how do I create an environment of well-being and thriving for my partner and for the people around us and for the people in our lives. And Paul, you and I have talked about this too. If you've been married any length of time, your marriage evolves, it changes, it becomes different. The way in which, when you're a starry-eyed newlywed, your needs, the things that you're looking for that are helpful in that marriage.
Sorry, that's my
one
phone
thing.
going off. I didn't
That's
have
all
it turned off. Bad job by me. Sorry.
So when you're newlywed, it's one thing. When you have young children, all of a sudden now your whole world revolves around this little tiny human, and your needs change. And that continues to evolve as your kids grow, as you become an empty nester, as you have health problems, as you have a financial crisis in your life. I mean, all the different things that you encounter as throughout a person's life in the marriage. The marriage changes, the needs that you have change, and so it flexes. The form constantly changes, the function always stays the same, and so that's how I approach it in this. So to answer your question more directly in terms of polyamory, the question for me isn't what kind of form is the most important. It's what is the function of your marriage? If your marriage designation is to be a loving environment to cause the most amount of human thriving in another person, that form may look like polyamory, or it may not. And it may look like that for a season and then not. It really depends on the better question than form to me is function. How are we creating loving environments? And that can look a million different ways, just like there's a million different marriages with people with different educational backgrounds and families of origin and physical disabilities and sexual orientations, and all those things are all different for everybody. But hopefully the function is the same, to create loving, healthy, and thriving environments.
And I think most people understand polyamory, but maybe give a brief definition of what polyamory can look like, what it means.
Yeah, the word polyamory, really two words: poly, meaning many, and amory or amorous, meaning love. Many loves is literally what it means. And the idea is that human beings have the capacity to love romantically more than one person at the same time. And, so obviously that's kind of a controversial position for a lot of folks. We're steeped very much in a very monogamous culture. And so even all our romantic comedies are kind of based on that. But the idea is, sometimes people share their hearts and or their bodies with other people. And when they do that, they call it polyamory, with the consent of their partners.
Right.
That's the important caveat to that. If you're cheating, that's not polyamory. That's cheating.
That's adultery at that point.
That's a whole different discussion, but that's not what we're talking about.
Well, and I do think actually for me, that's an important distinction, because my definition of sin isn't a violation of a rule book. Sin is violation of relationship. And so to me, two adults who are being honest with each other and are emotionally honest and say, even if it's, a husband that says, I'm going to go play 6 hours of golf every Saturday and Sunday, and the wife really isn't on board with that, to me, there's an emotional polyamory there that culture may say is okay, but I would still say it's sin, because that's a husband not being attentive to the emotional needs of a spouse. So whereas there may be situations where even sexually people can agree, okay, you can do this to fulfill this need that I can't, but we're still going to be together. So to me, sin is much different than here's the rules, because you can be in the rules of Christianity and still violating kind of the idea of relationship.
When we get into that rules-based stuff, it gets to be absurd after a while. It's we'd like life to be that simple, to where we just say, well, here's the rules, just follow the rules, everything works out great, but the old ethics question, is, you guy comes up to you with a gun and says, hey, I'm here to murder your neighbor, have you seen him? you know is it okay to lie,
Yeah.
at that point? And there might be a higher good there going on, beyond just following a rule of thou shalt not lie, kind of thing. And so, yeah, following rules-based religion, you paint yourself into a corner real quick with that, because the form of what comes out often is may have the appearance of goodness, but often can be very destructive.
Yeah. So let's talk about the problem perhaps that you're addressing in this book. Um, it's interesting what it stirs in me is I remember as a pastor of a church dealing with couples who were struggling in their
Mhm.
relationships, feeling like if I can't get this marriage fixed, it's a failure. And I can actually still clearly in my mind remember the first time as a pastor I ever said, you know what? I think you two need to get divorced. I think you're just making each other so miserable. Go to and it just seemed like such a failure of me as a pastor and all of
Yeah.
those things. But again, those are rules that get us stuck. And so I don't know, is that something around the issue that you're trying to address in the book? Something like that?
Well, around divorce, you mean,
I mean,
generally, or?
around maybe we get stuck feeling like marriage has to look a certain way because that's what we've been taught,
Yeah,
and you're
yeah,
trying to give some freedom maybe and release from shame, perhaps. I
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And again, everybody's different, and Paul, your experience is similar to mine as well. As you counsel couples, you realize real quick, man, all those formulas I learned, that it's just not quite that simple. Life is just a lot more complicated and nuanced, and everybody's different, and everybody has a different approach. And I've had those conversations too, where I've thought, man, it may very well be that divorce is the best of a lot of really bad options here.
yeah,
Not that divorce is a good thing, but it's like, I'm looking at your other options and they're even worse, and sometimes I think that's the case. And part of it, I think what's gotten us where we are today too is just the nature of human beings and human thriving physically. When your life expectancy was to be 35, 40 years old before, when you died, that's one thing to say, till death do us part, that's, there's not a whole lot of commitment there. But when you're going to live to be 90, man, we're talking about a serious commitment here, and there's a lot that happens, between in 60, 70 years,
yeah,
between when you say I do and when you actually die, so it's a pretty big commitment. And so I think that's part of what's happening in this conversation surrounding marriage as well, is sort of recognizing that, people grow, things change. uh, Sometimes people grow apart, and that's not really the fault of anybody necessarily. It's just the nature of what happens over the course of years and years and years and years. and
yeah.
and uh, and so again, trying not to be rigid and legalistic about it, and trying to allow for a certain amount of grace in all of that, to say, you know um, every situation is a little different, and the form of it, its expression, should be the secondary concern to what its purpose is. Its form.
I I, I actually know. I'm trying to count the numbers in my head, but I know couples for sure who are on second, third marriages
Hmm.
who are doing very, very well because I don't know, somehow that first marriage sometimes, and I'm in my first marriage still, but it seems like you're marrying for different reasons. It
Hmm.
may
Hmm.
just be because you grew up in an environment where you're not allowed to have sex, and you're just like, I want to have sex, so I want to get married. I'm driven by my sex drive. And then, after you're married a few years, you're like, oh, that all goes away, and now I got to live with this person. And so I don't
Yeah.
know if the better freedom is saying, uh you can be divorced and find somebody else, or what I hear you saying too is maybe there you can find other ways to live together so you don't have to get divorced, but the
Mhm.
partnership can change so you can have your shared history together, but maybe not have to separate.
Yeah, for sure. And you probably know couples like that too, that, they've sort of left, the traditional understanding of marriage behind. I know a couple that, they have a parenting marriage. They share parenting responsibilities. They live together under the same roof, but they have separate finances. I think they would consider themselves polyamorous. They have relationships outside of that, but sort of their relationship with each other is primarily parenting, and decided to stay together for the sake of the kids and try to make that work. But at the end of the day, yeah, they've found other ways to sort of express that's very, very non-traditional. Yeah.
And I think
And
a lot of us in Gen X are getting to the place where the kids are moving out,
mhm.
and I think those relationships are going to have to change. And my wife and I have been in conversations, and yes, our marriage isn't perfect all the time. You'll be shocked to hear, where there's sort of been this stated idea of like, yeah, but we made a vow at the altar together, and we've been thinking like, well, we don't want to be together because we're legally forced to be by some supernatural law. Can we
Yeah.
choose each other again? Can we find a way to choose each other again? And
Yeah, which
maybe
is beautiful.
that's yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm gonna go back a couple steps. That you're talking about people who get married, maybe, and their motivation is that uh, and you and I grew up evangelical, so I really related to that. Well, I really want to have sex, and the only way to get there is by saying these vows. Okay, I'll say them, kind of thing. But I in researching for the book, one of the things I discovered is that the divorce rate among evangelicals is actually higher than the divorce rate for the general population. And
Wow.
and here's the other caveat, that there's a pretty tight correlation with how many evangelicals you live around and your divorce rate. So not just evangelicals themselves, but if you live around evangelicals, your divorce rate is higher. And so they dug into that, trying to figure out, why is this the case? And what they discovered is that mostly it's because evangelicals marry so young. And when you're in a culture where everybody's marrying young, then other people marry young. And the
Yeah.
younger you marry, the higher the divorce rate. It's a pretty tight correlation there, because you don't know who you are. Sometimes your brains aren't even fully functioned and developed, and you don't understand often a lot of your own identity and needs and wants in life, and so the divorce rate for people who are young are really high, and so that motivation of, hey, let's get married so we can have sex, ends up being a huge backfire for evangelicals.
It's interesting because I've always heard the stat that divorce is equal in the church to outside, so it's now surpassed.
It's
And
surpassed, yes.
and I always used to hear, like, if two virgins get married, they're much more likely to not get divorced. Is there any statistic around that? Is that true or not true?
I didn't find anything in particular to that. I think they're too hard to find to, to do the
True.
research. Yeah, maybe. But
And I've always thought, what that there's two reasons for that stat. One, you don't know whether sex is good or not, if you've never had it before, I guess. And two, you're in an environment where divorce is extremely looked down upon. And
yeah,
so, you kind of go to the old uh, Anne Graham thing of like, I would rather kill my husband than divorce him, kind of a thing.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Because murder is much more socially acceptable than divorce. Yeah, which is kind of odd, really.
Yes.
But um, yeah, no, there was. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but there was research around. There was this notion that people who live together before marriage had a higher divorce rate than people that didn't, and they discovered that that wasn't the case. Actually, people who lived together before marriage actually had a lower divorce rate than those who didn't. So, um,
Interesting.
yeah. So
You
again,
know, you
yeah,
talked
and again,
about,
these correlations are they're not like 80% better marriage. I mean, it's like 15%. I mean, they're small margins, not like huge sweeps of generalizations, but yeah, definitely different than the propaganda we were fed anyway.
I've heard these correlations. Like you said, marriage was for survival for most of human history, and I've even heard in some cultures, I have, uh, you know, you get married and the woman knows the man is going to cheat on her, but there's sort of an agreed upon, but you're going
Hmm.
to take care of me and you're not going to do it in front of my face,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
is sort of that survival thing. But even in sort of first world marriages, more where maybe now we're looking more for love and fulfillment, I still think we're still human beings, and human beings have a basic need of safety, value, and purpose. I always say in my
For
coaching,
sure.
and and the thing that I find interesting is if we're asking one person for the next 50, 60, 70 years of our life, as you said, as we're getting older, and if we get married young, you're going to meet all those needs for me as this one person
Hmm.
forevermore, seems like kind of an unfair thing to put on another person, doesn't it? I mean, that's
Yeah.
almost an unfair expectation for another human being.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I have a whole chapter in the book on that, and it's a fool's errand, really, to think that you're going to find that magic person who will never stress you out and will fulfill every whim and desire that you've ever had in your life, and that'll just be easy. And I've had you probably had these experiences too, where you've counseled a couple and they're like, yeah, this is just really hard, and you think, yeah, marriage is, and they're like, no, but this is supposed to be my soulmate, it's supposed to be easy. you know it's like, no, it's hard, trust me, it's supposed to be hard. But yeah, that's for real, for sure.
What do you think about the idea being, evangelicals, as we are or have been, or post evangelical now, perhaps,
Hmm.
of the idea of sex being an intertwining of souls? That's where it's not like other things. It's not like going golfing with the boys as an intimate emotional intimacy, or having a meeting with somebody of the opposite gender, but sex being a soul tie, as we've always
Hmm.
heard, versus being
Yeah.
just a human biological event that we can do and not create some supernatural thing that we have to be exercised from sometime in the future.
Yeah, I heard this sermon years ago from John Ortberg, and he used this framework that I really liked. He talked about, in human sexuality, we have a tendency to think of ourselves either as angels or animals, and and so the animal thing is, we just say, hey, we're mammals, right? And we have hormones, and we see things that we want to have sex with, and so that's what we do, and so what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, and that's sort of the mindset. um but I think most honest people, what separates us from most other mammals is that human beings are just meaning making machines, and it's really hard to have a sexual encounter with another human being without asking, so what did that mean?
Mm.
Dogs don't sit around pondering, does she really love me for more than just my body, kind of thing. Or cats don't say, I just don't think you're as committed to this as I am. They don't think about the meaning of things like human beings do. And so I think one extreme is that we say, we're just animals, but we're not. I mean, if any honest look at that, if that was the case, I mean, we wouldn't make a big deal about sexual harassment or rape or things like that. Obviously, it's more than just a biological function. It's something more meaningful than that. The other extreme is to treat ourselves like angels, that that we that our physical selves don't exist, that it doesn't matter, that sexuality doesn't matter at all to us, or that human desire doesn't matter at all. And either one of those extremes is harmful. If we pretend like, if we minimize human sexuality to like, oh well, it's just sex kind of thing, I think we're doing ourselves as big a disservice as if we pretend that we're animals as well. I mean, so I think that we're neither angels nor animals. We're somewhere in between there, and finding that sort of healthy in between, I think, is where most human thriving takes place.
Now you're talking nuance, and you can no longer be a part of that evangelical circles.
That's why they kicked me out. Yeah.
I think that's brilliant, because we do look at these things as binary, and marriage, particularly for young women, is taught as this, again, a survival mechanism. Don't withhold yourself from your husband. Don't let yourself gain weight. Keep your husband. I can't get over how many fat pastors I've seen teaching women, like, keep yourself in shape. And
the irony
so
knows no end. Yeah.
We do make sex to be either this very soulful or survival thing. And some humans, maybe sometimes we just do it because it's fun and it feels good and it's just part of what we do. And can we just not?
Yeah. And I think
theology, you're right.
Theology generally has been, focused around dysfunction, right? Just like Western medicine, and Western psychology, we tend to focus on, the problems, what goes wrong, and instead of what goes right. And it's just recently that, Western psychology began to study things like happiness and joy and things like that, and asking questions like, what does it take for humans to really be happy and thrive and feel well? And likewise in health, Western medicine's very much about trying to fix the problems that we already have, as opposed to trying to prevent those problems, or what it means to be a healthy person. And so I think, and theology has been same thing. It's really focused around sin and about like what goes wrong, and questions around sexuality focus around like, what can go wrong with human sexuality? Well, yeah, there's some things that can go wrong with it. It can be really, dehumanizing. It can be really bad, at times, and brutal. But it also can be pretty amazing and pretty beautiful, and it can bond human beings together, and it can be very meaningful to people. And so, we get caught up in the dysfunction of it without. I never feel like I have to theologically justify a sunset or a beautiful piece of music or a really well-prepared meal or something like that, but for some reason we have to theologically justify sex, the pleasure of sex, I mean, and why is that? What is our hang up with that we feel like, we have to sort of justify the fact that, well, maybe it just feels good, maybe we just like it. Is that okay?
That is such a brilliant point. I love that. I'm mulling that over in my head. Like, I never have to theologically justify a sunset. That is really a powerful thought. Is that yours, or did you steal it from somebody?
Yeah, I probably read it somewhere a long time ago, but I'm not smart enough to give credit where it's due. So,
well, I always said, as a pastor, the first time you attribute to somebody, the second time you say, I've heard it said, and then the third time it's yours.
I've always said, yes.
Yeah. But that's so true. And I actually just read an article the other day about how masturbation is good for you and has, really positive attributes. And we were just taught all the time growing up, like, no, it's the worst thing you can do, and it's horrible. And we've just been so scared of human function for so long. It makes me laugh. The book is The Knot. You saw on, if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, danahicks.blog is the website. The book is The Knot: How to Secure Healthy Modern Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. And it's Dana Hicks, the author we're talking with here. And one of the things that's a focus of your book is marriage and relationships as a whole. And some of this may
Mhm.
be post COVID for one, but it's definitely generational. These things are changing. And like I said, marriage hasn't been the same in the past. And it looks like it's not going to be the same in the future.
Right, right. Yeah, it's evolving a lot, and part of it's just, when you've got a failure rate of 50%, at some point people are like, "Yeah, I'm not sure I want to roll those dice," and play those odds, and so the number of people getting married is declining, and so, what's that? So that makes it kind of tricky when we talk about divorce rates. It's like, well, the number of people are who are actually getting married is declining. The way they used to calculate divorce rates is they would go to the county records and they'd say, oh, look, they had 10,000 people applied for marriage licenses and 5,000 people filed for divorces. So 50% failure rate, is because you don't have a crystal ball to know,
Right.
when Joe and Ann go down and apply for their marriage license, we don't know if they're going to make it, a year, 10 years, 50 years. We have no idea, so that's how they would calculate it. And but then less people started getting married, so that kind of threw your odds off, in terms of how you calculate those things. When the marriage rates are going down and the divorce rates are staying the same. So it's kind of hard to know those numbers of the divorce rate, but we do know that less people are getting married than used to. But that's slowly been in decline. But the divorce rate actually is the number of people filing for divorce is actually starting to go down a little bit. And I think some of that is that people are finding new ways to make their marriage work that would have been deal breakers in the past. And so they're rethinking marriage. They're rethinking what that might look like, and staying together in a situation that in the past would have just been a divorce.
And isn't that good? I mean, there's this concept of, family is the building block of culture and all
Hmm.
of those things. And so it would seem to me Christians being open to finding ways to help people stay together rather than the bondage of marriage vows and things would be advantageous if people found new ways to stay together rather than the very emotional and expensive divorce path.
Yeah, and for children, really, what's good for children is not necessarily to have two married parents, but for to have a stable environment.
Mm,
And so if we're really interested in children doing well, our question shouldn't be, hey, how do we keep people from getting divorced? Our question should be, how do we create environments that are stable for them? And that would probably give us better outcomes in terms of families going forward, rather than saying, well, we want this to be Leave It to Beaver family, you know, look
yeah.
look just like that in the 50s.
Seems like that makes a lot of sense. Interesting. You say online relationships are becoming a big thing, obviously, and again, this is a
Yeah.
maybe partially some post-COVID, but we're always, well, you can't build a true relationship online through what we're doing here, but you would disagree with that, perhaps.
Well, yeah, I don't have a dog in that fight, but I just know that it's definitely a pattern that's out there. Paul, you and I, as young as we like to think we are, we're not these digital natives, and they these younger folks, God bless them, they just think different than you and I do in terms of the way they understand, these relationships. What kind of turned my thinking on it was I had a pastor colleague who was in his 20s. Then we were talking about this, and he had been a youth pastor for quite a while, and we were talking about online relationships, and I was making fun of him, like, oh, they're whatever, you meet somebody online, they're catfishing you or whatever, you don't really know what they're like. It's some 40-year-old guy sitting in the basement with his mom's house or whatever, and he said, listen, you may not think those are real or meaningful, he said, but when I work with teenagers, they are very real and they are very meaningful to them, and they take them very seriously, whether you do or not. So, and that sort of changed my thinking on it, to think, if they think it's real, then I should probably at least give some credence to this and recognize that it's not my cup of tea, but that's not to say that for other folks, it's very obviously a different kind of relationship when you're not, in person. Paul, you and I have never met in person. We've just had a digital relationship, but I like you anyway.
Well, I have business partners that I worked with for 2 years, and back in October, I saw them face to face for the first time ever. It was
Oh wow, yeah,
really odd to see them three-dimensionally and have
yeah.
legs. But where this really hit me, and I can remember in the pastoral world, people talk, well, should we stream our services? Should we not? All these
Hmm.
things we're talking about, like how can you, minister to people? And for me, it was the Manti Te'o football player story, if you remember that, where
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
he had the fiance that he had, that had died. And then we found out like he had never seen this person face to face. And I'm like,
Hmm.
and I knew my kids were using Snapchat, and like we don't
Hmm.
really call each other ever anymore. We just Snapchat each other and things. And that's when the light really went on for me. Like for this generation, both my kids are Gen Zers. It is as real as anything else. If you're texting, it is as real a relationship as anything else we've ever done.
Yeah, yeah. Let me tie that all back to the polyamory discussion, if we could, too, because
Sure.
one of the things I read somewhere that really kind of stuck in my mind, and this isn't in the book, but I was thinking about this, how, um, you know, especially as religious folks really get caught up in the sex discussion, of polyamory. But I think that in a broader framework, what some polyamorous folks are trying to do is to say, we can't get all of our needs from one person. It's an unrealistic expectation that we're setting. So how do we create a community around ourselves in which, I get emotional support from over here, and I get financial advice over here, and I get, friendship over here, and I have an activity partner over here. And we have all these different people that play these different roles in our lives. And I was thinking about that, thinking, I have friends. I'm thinking of one friend in particular I have in Portland who's been a friend since I was a teenager, and we're in contact. We support each other. We love each other. We care for each other. It's not a sexual relationship by any means, but we're committed to each other in some kind of way that is more than just like, hey, here's a Christmas card kind of thing, that they're an important part of my life. And even though we haven't set up any kind of formal commitment kind of thing, I think that there's something to that we can learn from. That I have friends that are here in Phoenix where I live that are close. I also have friends that are in Portland and Boise where I used to live, and all over. And I think those are very real and meaningful relationships to me, even though I don't see them in person often. And they play a part in my life that I think adds richness and meaning to my life in ways that the ways it might not have in my life. So um, I think for me anyway, that's a healthy way of seeing it, a healthy way of thinking about it, of how all these different people play roles in my life.
Yeah. It's there's a million ideas rolling around in my head, and I'm watching people comment here in our live. It's obviously for those of us who are in this space that we're sort of commonly calling deconstruction. In
Mhm.
some ways, sort of everything comes on the table, and it seems like heterosexual sexuality may be the last thing. Although clearly, I mean, we know there are extremes that are still sort of anti LGBTQ plus or queer or any of those things. But
Yeah.
yeah, an idea of a polyamorous relationship. And again, we would say, I mean, you look at the Matt Chandler thing going on, it doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. It's that whole Mike Pence idea of not meeting with a woman. You can have emotional relationships with people that are very deep. And it
Mhm.
feels like this is what we thought was a godly construct that you're telling us is a human construct that we need to learn to be flexible with to help humans function inside of it. Is that a good summary of what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I think so. I think what we're discovering is that when we isolate ourselves in one relationship, it can be very dehumanizing and
Yeah.
very frustrating. It's really and it's really the way in which we've constructed it, I think, is self-destructive. And um, and I understand if you want to be monogamous, and I think a lot of people do. Yeah, you need to set up boundaries for what that looks like, but that doesn't mean just because you're sexually monogamous that you're not going to have friends, that you're not going to have emotional support from family members, that you're not going to have meaningful relationships outside of that. That seems, again, we used to live so communally, human beings, that is,
Mm-hmm.
in tribes and ways in which we could lean on other people for other things. And only, in recent human history have we had this sort of notion that we're going to be these autonomous little families that will be self-contained and have everything that we need within them, which is just a ridiculous idea.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that focus on the family, traditional family, biblical family, and I always say to that thing, like, Jesus would have never known a family like that. That whole thing about in my father's house are many rooms, that means you went and got your wife and you brought her back to your father's house and you lived with your father and the rest of that community.
Right.
And
Right.
I have heard this from my Latin friends, particularly my Latinx friends.
Hmm.
Like, they're like, man, we're multi-generational, living
Hmm.
in houses together, and you guys are missing it. You're missing the value of having
Well,
grandma
for
and
sure.
grandpa and friend and aunt around when you're doing your traditional family thing. And so we may have missed something here in this focus on the family, traditional family idea.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah.
It's crazy, isn't it? How much did purity culture impact this? I think a lot of us are starting to realize what purity culture did to us to create trauma around
Hmm.
sexuality and human interaction. How much do you put on this and attribute it back to purity culture?
Yeah. Purity culture, I talk about in the book. I think the biggest sleight of hand that has happened in Christian theology in the last few hundred years is this idea of purity culture, that all of a sudden we shifted what it meant to be a virtuous person. For centuries in Christian history, to be a virtuous person was to say, I cared for the needs of the widows and the orphans and the immigrants in my community and the poor, and I looked out for the marginalized in my community. And that was the indication that you were a virtuous person if you did those sorts of things. And the insidious thing that purity culture did was it shifted uh, what it meant to be a virtuous person to be purely about personal passions. So long as I kept my pants on, I was virtuous, right?
Mm,
And so that really allowed me to be pretty self-righteous about people who couldn't keep their pants on, number one. And number two, it was pretty kind of simple, really. I mean, it's a lot easier to keep my pants on than to actually feed the poor, to be really honest, you know. And
true.
and and so I think it was insidious. I really do. I think it was diabolical. And so now all of a sudden we've defined what it means to be pure and righteous and holy purely in sexual terms,
Mm,
which again, in the scope of human history and the scope of church history is just bizarre, weird left turn that we took. And I understand it from the sense of it sure made things a lot easier, and allowed us to then blame people, blame single mothers, to blame people who who didn't measure up to our standard of holiness, so that we didn't have to feel compassion for them because they weren't very virtuous. So it allowed us to sort of step away from that as well. But yeah, I think that's just the beginning of it. I mean, theologically, that's my biggest beef with it. Psychologically, man, and I know, I mean, there's thousands of people in therapy for this, trying to figure it out, and trying to work through the baggage of what it means. What's interesting, Paul? I wrote this book. I wrote it for evangelicals, really, because I'm a post-evangelical as well, and I know how they think. I know that part of it is exactly this sort of idea, how purity culture has torn them apart. But what's been interesting to me is how people who have no sort of theological background have kind of picked up on it, as have read the book and thought, oh yeah, this is really helpful, and so I thought, well, that's really interesting. So I reached out to a couple of podcasters that did polyamory podcasts, and I said, hey, listen, I got this religious book, but I know a lot of your readers probably have like this religious background and they're really wrestling with this, and I had a couple of them reach out to me and be like, yes, this is a huge issue for us, can you come on and talk about this? And I find that to be really interesting. That originally my thought was, that this would be an evangelical book, but it really, I think, has a broader sort of appeal, I think, than just that.
I think you're 100% right, and part of that is, I tell people all the time, you could have grown up never going to a church, but you're still in America under the influence of Christianity. It permeates our culture. And I think everybody grows up with some idea that I'm going to marry one person, we're going to stay together. And so offering to release the shame of that from people to look for options. What do you think about bigamy? Do you think we ought to look at bigamy as an option in the United States?
Like multiple legal spouses, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
I think that's outside the scope of public policy, and it's outside the scope of my book. I'm not sure I want to go down that road.
I got you. Okay.
That's how Utah got to be a state, was they finally gave up that. But it works. I tell you what. Here's I'll say this. I find this really interesting. When so one of the hats I've worn over my years in ministry was I sat on the board of a small NGO that did economic development projects in Africa. And so I've been to Africa half dozen times or so. And of course, then you get to know people, church leaders and whatnot in Africa. And I'll never forget, first time we encountered, people who had multiple spouses, guys that had multiple wives in Africa, which is not uncommon at all, in fact, most cultures around the world, except for Western cultures, it's not at all uncommon to have polygamous marriages. And so, but what I think surprised me was, of course, as an American, I automatically assumed, oh, this is about sex. This is why they want to have multiple marriages. The reality was, when a woman became a widow in that culture, they didn't have a lot of rights. They didn't have a lot of options. And for a guy to take her in and marry her was a huge act of compassion and mercy to allow them to survive and thrive. And so, again, from our Western lenses, we look at that as like, oh, I can't believe this guy's got all these wives, and what kind of sex pervert is he? But the reality is, he's actually a pretty good dude. That he's done a really good thing for this person, and care for her and her children, to take them under her wing, and so. So to answer your question, again, this is form and function again, right?
Right.
The bigger question isn't like, what's the best form? The bigger question is like, how do we create the most human thriving and create the most loving environments?
Right.
And sometimes that's going to mean having multiple wives.
That's where my question was coming from is it wise for the government to limit that as an option? And why do we do that? Now, I mean, I understand in Mormonism, this has not played out well a lot of the times, and there's been rape and child marriage and terrible things.
Right.
But I don't know that it necessarily has to be that way. If we just started taking misogyny and patriarchy out of things and saying, find the best form that works for you, then maybe
Right.
these things don't happen in the dark like that.
Yeah, and there'll always be, we'll always want to have legal parameters around. I mean, you don't want to legalize rape, for example, or
Absolutely. Yeah.
non-consent of sex with minors, things like that. I mean,
Age
those
of
are those are
consent, I think, is really important.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when you talk form and function, we're talking about interpersonal relationships.
Right.
There's obviously there's no form of a relationship with a minor that would be loving and thriving. I mean, that would create a healthy situation. So we can write off that whole form. But I think you're right. I think it's fair to say, but let's look at some other things when we're talking about adults, when we're talking about consenting, when we're talking about these other things that are in place. Maybe we should have maybe a little bit broader understanding of what that could entail.
Yeah. And I think all of those are creating grace, a space for grace for people. And I love that you said, this has all, morality, purity has all become about, now being anti-abortion and it's, I always laughed, like, we're wanting to ban books from libraries, but there's no more sex-filled book in the world than the Bible, with all kinds of outrageous sex that the Bible doesn't necessarily condemn. And what you said so well there is, when I say, the command of the Bible, the never-ending command of the Bible is actually seek justice, not just take care of, but like seek justice for the poor, the foreigner. The Bible says outcast. I call that marginalized, the LGBTQ, or in our culture, the non-Christian. And then the widow, as you said, that's the person who is prevented from the economic system from having opportunity that's equal to others. And so I think the widow is one we kind of throw away sometimes, that is actually very, very important, that we're supposed to, who don't have access to the justice system or the economic system. And so what I love about what you're saying here is turning us away from the idea of morality is not having sex with somebody you're not married to really finding solutions that work in interpersonal relationships in life. And brilliant.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
Thanks. I love that. So the book, let me get my cat back here. The book is, I don't know why my thing does that sometimes. The book is The Knot. It's a marriage book, but it's not like other Christian marriage books. And the subtitle is How to Secure Healthy Modern Relationships While Not Being Tied to Marriage's Past. First, tell us where you can find it, and then who do you recommend the book for?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, and the paperback came out. It's on Kindle paperback, and it just came out on Audible today. So after dealing with all their politics, that was a whole nother story. But we finally got that up on Audible, so it's got an audio version as well. Yeah, like I mentioned before, I wrote this from Evangelical Framework, because that's where I've spent the vast majority of my life, and trying to think about people who think like me, or thought like me, I should say, and what are some of the things that they would be wrestling with? What are some of the things that they'd be struggling with in terms of marriage, and hopefully giving people a sense of freedom in that. That being said, like I say, I think I've handed this out to people with no church background at all, and they've found a lot of help in it, just in terms of communicating expectations and ways that we think about having other people in our lives that add meaning and richness to our lives outside of our primary partners, and what that might look like. So
very, very good. Again, the book is The Knot. Dr. Hicks, you can find on danahicks.blog, so you can see it on the screen and live.
Yeah, and there's a link.
What are
There's a
people gonna
link
see
to the
there?
book on the website too. If you go there, you can find the Amazon link as well. So,
And I'm assuming there's some blogs there as well.
yeah, good guess. Good guess.
Well, Dana, I think fascinating book. I think
Oh, thank you,
timely,
Paul.
and I hope people get a chance to read it and start to think about some different options. So thanks for doing the work, and thanks for coming
Oh,
to tell us
yeah.
about it.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. All right, let me end our broadcast here.